So in a normal energy project, when the price drops too much, they shut in production and then they restart it later. And no one likes to do that. It costs something, it costs time, and you're not getting income in the meantime, but it can be done. But you can't do that in the Russian permafrost. If the crude stops moving through the permafrost layer for any reason, it freezes into gel, and the water that comes up as a byproduct freezes into ice. And when water turns into ice, it expands and it pops the pipe from the inside. What's going on right now is the insurance ban on Russian vessels on January 1 will expand to any vessel carrying any Russian cargo. And at the same time, the Europeans are about to enact their ban, saying that no Russian crude whatsoever can be sold by any boat to any European market. And that is going to force a degree of shut-in the ports. The pressure will build back up to the wells, and then the wells will freeze solid. That's going to happen pretty quick. And since the demand for energy tends to be inelastic, you get an outsized price response. So assuming for the moment that all else is equal, and I realize that is never true, you remove 4 million barrels a day of Siberian output, and you're going to get $180 oil. Now, that was my forecast when I saw you last time. Since then, the Chinese look like they're going out of their way to experience an economic crisis. And if we see a drastic decrease in their ability to absorb crude, that's going to change the price forecast. There's so much in motion right now, but none of it is great.
But where does a smart investor then put money these days? Is it, I've had people, gold bugs, and, we see what's happening in crypto. You have a chapter, and I've heard you talk about the US dollar. It's still, for all of its flaws, being the best currency in a terrible global neighborhood of currencies. So where are you putting your 401k?
I like companies that center their production and their sales in North America, because we've got the highest value added labor system between Mexico and the United States, and we produce where we sell for the most part. Also, if the product is demographically driven in terms of its demand profile, I like that. And if the end product is very energy intensive for its production, because we have the cheapest electricity and energy in the world, that's great. And if the end product is exportable, that's kind of like my trifecta. And so agricultural processing, petrochemicals, things like that are most of my portfolio. Since the Ukraine war started, I have gotten into commodities in a very big way, but I will caution you that most players in most commodity markets are truly global, and you want to make sure you are not exposed to Ukraine or Russia or Brazil, because the Russian system is fallen apart, the Ukrainian system is unlikely to come back, and Brazil is dependent upon material inputs that come from Russia. So you've got to be very, very careful where you're putting your money in that space, or you're going to get exposed to all the bad along with the good. I don't have the data in front of me, but on the whole, roughly 40 to 50% of Brazilian fertilizer inputs are sourced from the former Soviet Union, and most of the remainder is either China or the Middle East. So, there's no version of this picture that looks good for Brazil.
Well, let's talk about food then, because you talked about ag commodities, and, I'm thinking in my head, soybeans, corn. Your outlook in terms of food supplies and famine is sobering. Is that sobering a good word for your outlook?
That's a very calm way to put it. Let me make this a little bit more broad. So most of the economic growth that the world, not the US, the world has experienced since 1990 is that we've brought in an empire worth of raw materials from the Russian space. And we've brought in 1 billion workers from the Chinese space. And the outputs from both of those systems have allowed Brazil to bloom in a way that it never could before. We're now seeing all of that in reverse. And if you remove a lot of the added fertilizer that's come into the situation, then the 2.5 billion people that we have added since 1990 are in some very real danger. Because Brazil is the world's second largest agricultural exporter. Russia is the world's largest exporter of wheat. Ukraine is number 5, and Chinese capital has been part of what's made this all work. And we've seen an increase of the Chinese lifespan by over 40%, 50% since 1990. These things are all linked together, and when you take away the food supply that has allowed all of this to happen, we get to a very dark place very, very quickly. And you cannot replace fertilizer supplies quickly. Nitrogen and phosphate take a minimum of 3 years. Potash usually takes 10. And so far, we've only lost roughly 1/3 of the former Soviet Union's output of this stuff. And that has already been enough for almost every producer in the world to have gone through all of their reserves. The only reason we're not in a food crisis already is because people had reserves, and Mother Nature was very, very kind to us this past year. There's no way we're going to repeat that next year. We're in this weird situation where the Biden administration is trying to provide letters of comfort to point out to financiers and shippers that these things are not under sanctions in order to limit the damage. But if you're a financial house and you see these sanctions getting tighter and tighter and tighter, and with every new genocide that the Russians propagate, you got to wonder whether you want to be affiliated at all. So most, to this point, of the reduction in fertilizer shipments, roughly 1/3, has been because companies don't want to touch it, not because they're under sanction. What's going to happen over the next years, we're starting to see industrial accidents in a lot of these places because most of the technology, most of the infrastructure that produces this stuff dates back to the 60s, and it's only been held together since 1990 with Western duct tape and technical work and people shoehorning parts into it. That's not happening anymore. So in the natural gas sector, we're literally seeing explosions at gas processing facilities that you can see from space. And fertilizers, in many ways, is a derivative of petrochemicals, especially for nitrogen. And because natural gas is caught up in the Russia-European mix, the Europeans have stopped making it at all. So it's not all just a direct interruption of Russian and Belarusian shipments. So we're seeing pressure throughout the entire supply chain in the former Soviet and European space. And we're only at the beginning of that.
Well, so then walk us through, get your crystal ball out then, and what happens to Russia then? Does Putin end up with a bullet in the back of his head, or dragged through the streets like Muammar Gaddafi? To me, it seems
if Putin were to die tomorrow, I don't think it would change the course of the war. The clique that runs the Russian system broadly sees the world from the same point of view as Putin, and so you might get a difference in style, but I don't think you get any difference in the real approach to the conflict, and I don't think the war would end. The question to ask is whether or not Russia's going to win or lose this, and we don't know yet. We will know in May and June, because we're at a bit of an operational pause right now because the Ukrainians are assimilating a lot of Russian gear that they've captured. They've captured almost twice as much gear from the Russians in the last 3 months as they started the war with, in addition to everything that's coming from NATO. So by the time they're done with that process in the beginning of May, the Ukrainian military will have 5 times the capacity of what it started the war with. That's just incredible. At the same time, the Russians are going to be throwing 500,000 to 1 million more men into the war as well. So it's going to be a very different war, but May is when mud season is over, and they can all maneuver and get at one each other in a very big way. And we will know by the end of June at the latest who is going to rule at that sort of conflict, and then we can start making predictions about who's going to win.
What does the future of Russia then look like, win, lose, or draw?
It looks a lot like the history of Russia, an inefficient state that's run by a kleptocratic aristocratic class that oppresses everyone around it in a desperate attempt to find some security. I mean, we've seen this movie before. We've seen it at least 11 times. The explosion in output that we saw since 1990 was largely because of British Petroleum, or I guess it's just BP now, and the Western services firms. They're all gone. And so we know that those fields are going to decay in time, independent of what happens with the sanctions or the tariffs or insurance. I don't want to suggest that Russia is going to go to zero, but the longer this war goes on, the greater the chance that there's going to be damage to the onshore pipelines, in addition to anything that the Europeans, the Americans, and the Japanese do. So we should all consider that anything value added coming out of Russia and anything raw commodity coming out of Russia is going to drop precipitously, and in many cases suddenly. But we shouldn't expect to see much of any of it coming back within the next several years. Because again, the last time it took 30 years to rebuild the capacity, and that's when the West was very tightly involved. We're not anymore. I'm not concerned about rare earths at all. That's a processing issue. And the ore that produces rare earth elements comes from almost every mine in the world as a byproduct. So it's just a question of building out the processing capacity. And once the Chinese started to try to blackmail the Japanese a few years ago, a lot of countries, the US included, built out some of that processing capacity. So if there ever was a shortage, we could kind of switch some gears and within a few months have a domestic supply. So I'm not concerned about that. It's like the one thing I'm not concerned about. Industrial gases are a messy space because every gas has its own economics, but all of them are sourced from something called an air separation unit, which just takes the atmosphere and splits it into different chunks. Most air separation is done for oxygen and nitrogen as part of steel foundries, and that's no exception when it comes to the former Soviet Union. The problem is it requires a second stage of separation in order to get the trace gases like helium and neon. And that second stage is usually done at a different facility that's more advanced. And in the case of the former Soviet Union, where 80% of the stuff comes from, that second stage was largely done in Mariupol, and all the infrastructure has been destroyed.
Interesting.
For those of you who don't know, helium and neon are the two critical components in semiconductor etching lasers. So we are going to have a massive global shortage in semiconductor fabrication capacity within a year. Several companies, most notably Taiwanese ones, after the last scare we had with neon, which happened back in 2014 with the last Russia-Ukraine war, have invested a lot in recycling of the cartridges that have the neon and the helium, and they've made a degree of progress, and those recycling facilities are actually located in-house. So there are some technologies under development with this and different kinds of lasers to try to slim down the need. It's not happening fast enough, but it is happening. Intel's not reshoring. That's a fundamentally new technology that they're implementing at scale, and most of the high-end fab facilities that the Biden administration is encouraging fall into that category. The key to remember with semiconductors is there's different categories of quality. The high end that goes into servers and phones and computers, that was already done here, as well as in Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. And so when we expand our footprint of this stuff, we're actually taking market share from allies. The low end, the Internet of Things, your smart light bulbs, that's all China.